it yesterday, in the 19th century, in 1859. But I ought to tell you something about what preceded that revival. In the early 19th century in Northern Ireland, there was a great controversy and fight over Arianism. Now, do you know what Arianism is? Arianism is the kind of cult in which you deny that Jesus is God. And you stop worshipping God. It's named after a man called Arius in the early church who didn't believe that Jesus was God. And there was a great burst of Arianism in the church of Northern Ireland, especially the Presbyterians in Northern Ireland in the early 20th century. And the Bible-believing Christians didn't like it. And they started resisting it. They started fighting Arianism, saying, no, Jesus is God. We must worship him. We bow the knee. His name is above every name. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And they began to battle and fight and argue, and they won the battle. They removed people who would not worship Jesus. They removed pastors who would not worship Jesus as God, and they won the battle. And when they had won the battle, God poured out the Spirit upon them. And the great 1859 revival began. But you see, there was about 20 years before that revival. There was about 20 years when they were dealing with false teaching and they were dealing with Arianism. Very often you find that when you deal with things that are wrong and you go back to the Word of God and you clear out the rubbish in the church. Sometimes there's a lot of rubbish in the church. You clear out the rubbish in the church and the false teaching and things that are not really right. And you go back to what is true and right and good. You break down the Asherah poles. You get rid of the false religion. You deal with these things that ought not to be there, and God begins to honor you, and revival breaks out. Sometimes it's reform that leads to revival. It's not always. I'm not making a strict law about it, but often that's the way it is. And so it was with Asa. His life begins with reform. And the same thing was true of Josiah. You can go and read his story. Once again, he discovered things, as I was saying yesterday, and then he discovered the law, the book of Deuteronomy, and then the revival broke out. There was reform first. But then, secondly, I want you to notice how much this revival here begins in prayer. We read that Asa commanded the people of Judah, verse 4. He commanded Judah to seek the Lord, the God of their fathers. He said to them, now, come on, let's seek God. We're done with this reform. We're breaking down all these false things. But let's seek the Lord. Let's inquire of him. Let's ask his will. Let's get to know him. Let's hear his voice. Let's obey his commands. Let us seek the Lord. And it says that they did that. They began to seek the Lord. And it led to great blessing. It led to stability, and the high places were removed, and it led to peace in the land. And the same thing is said later on. This prophet comes in chapter 15. And the prophet says, if you seek him, he will be found by you. I don't know how much time it will take for revival to come to India. Will it come next year? Will it come in our lifetime? I don't know. Suppose it doesn't come in our lifetime. Supposing we spend all of our life preparing for revival, but revival comes upon our grandchildren. What do you think about that? You say, oh, well, I wanted it in my lifetime. Well, I don't know. Maybe God will use you to prepare the way. Maybe you'll have to be content with something happening 10 years' time. I mean, there's a big problem out there. There's a massive country, 1 billion people to reach. Maybe it'll take a bit of time seeking God before God moves. I don't know. But if you seek him, you will find him. You may say, how long do I have to seek him? I answer, as long as it takes. You seek him, and you go on seeking. You say, we want God in our church. Never mind about these other things. We want God. We're not wanting money. We're not wanting prosperity. We're not wanting fame. We're not wanting just marvelous music. We're not even wanting great preachers. We're wanting God. We want God. And you seek the presence of God. If you seek him, you will find him. And there are certain preliminaries. There are certain things that lead into revival. And one of them is seeking him. And in the story of revival often begins by one or two people praying. In fact, I think every single revival, you will find somewhere there was someone praying for it. I was telling you yesterday about the revival in Lewis in 1949. And after that revival had started, people began to ask the question, how did this revival begin? How comes God began to move in this place? And they began to inquire and find out what was happening and what led to this revival. And they found that there were two old ladies in the island who had covenanted together to pray and to pray and to pray and to pray until God blessed that island. And two old ladies. And I referred you yesterday to James McQuilkin. And that 1859 revival that came to Northern Ireland, it began in New York. And it crossed the Atlantic. And it came to all over to Sweden, to Charles Spurgeon's congregation. But it began with a man called James McQuilkin. He was nothing very special. He wasn't a preacher, he was just a nominal Christian. But one day he got truly saved. And when he got truly saved, he came truly to salvation. He began to hunger for God. And he started a prayer meeting. And people loved this prayer meeting. And they started another one, and another one, another one. And eventually there were dozens of these prayer meetings all over New York. It was a prayer revival. People seeking God, even before the actual outpouring of the Spirit and great preachers. Before that, before there was great preaching, there was great praying. And there were these prayer meetings. It was a prayer revival. And revival has sometimes come that way. Sometimes it's begun with a kind of prayer revival. And it was the same in the great evangelical awakening. When the Spirit was poured out on Jonathan Edwards in 1734, 1735, he wrote the story of it. In a very humble way. He didn't boast and glorify himself. In a very humble way. He just wrote a book. It was called A Narrative of Surprising Conversions. In that 18th century, he wrote a book, The Narrative of Surprising Conversions. He just told the story of how a surprising number of people had been saved in that town of Northampton in New England in America. And people all over Europe began to read that book, A Narrative of Surprising Conversions. And people began to pray. And they began to say, well, if it happened in Northampton, in the middle of America somewhere, maybe it can happen here. And all over Europe, people used that book, and it got them praying. They began to plead, Lord, if you did it a couple of years ago in Northampton, do it among us. If you did it way out there in colonial America, do it among us. And it started people praying. And in those 1730s, one after the other, people began to be blessed. I believe that the charismatic movement began that way. I was a young teenager in 1959. And 1959 was the anniversary, the 100th anniversary of the 1859 revival. And all over Britain and other places, there were people saying, well, this is the anniversary of the great revival 100 years ago. Let's pray. And various revival fellowships began. I can remember as a little boy, as a teenager, going to prayer meetings in the middle of London where I was the youngest there. Everybody else had grey beards and they were old. I was the youngest. And I was a teenager with all these old guys, and they were all praying for revival. They would pray all night. I remember times when I would go to a prayer meeting, they would start at 7 o'clock on Saturday night, and they would pray all night and stop at 8 o'clock on Sunday morning and go to church. And people were praying, Lord, you poured out the Spirit in 1859. Why can't you pour out the Spirit in 1959? And 3 years later, the charismatic movement began. And all over the world, there came new moving of the Spirit. Those very people who had been praying for an outpouring of the Spirit, well, it wasn't a mighty revival, but the charismatic movement has been a powerful movement. Millions of people have come to the Lord Jesus Christ through what happened beginning in about 1962, and it's still somewhat coming to its ends, but its influence is still with us even today. These things begin in prayer. Someone somewhere begins to pray and to seek God. And so Asa begins to seek the Lord. He tells the people to seek the Lord. This prophet comes. He says to the king, if you seek him, you will be found by him. So very often there's a period of reform. Very often there's people who begin to pray, and they get very earnest about praying. They persist. They don't give up very easily. But then thirdly, it often happens that there's some great crisis that leads you to want God more than anything else in the world. You better be careful. You want to pray for revival? You better be careful. When you start praying for revival, anything can happen. And it may not be such good news. You see, here's King Asa. He's got right with God. He's reformed the land. There's peace. There's prosperity. And he's seeking God. And suddenly, from nowhere, this man begins to rise up against him. We read that Zerah, the Cushite, marched against him with a vast army, a mighty army. Thousands upon thousands suddenly begin to invade the land. And Asa has been a godly man. He's not being punished for his sin. He's not been a sinful man. He's been a righteous man. He's been reforming the land. And suddenly, in the middle of reform and seeking God, suddenly he faces the biggest problem he's ever faced in his life. And this very often happens. You see, you may be in some church meeting and God speaks to you and you say, oh, I really want to seek the Lord. I'll do anything if only I can find God. And you go to work on Monday morning and you're dismissed or given the sack or retrenched or whatever word you use here in India. Suddenly you lose your job. And you say, Lord, you know, I was going to seek you and now I'm in the biggest trouble I've ever been in. And you don't know it. But what happened on Monday morning was the answer to your prayer on Sunday morning. Oh, you wanted to be blessed? God said, oh, I'm going to put you through something that will make you pray more than you've ever prayed in your life. You want to trust in me? Well, I'll take everything away, and then you're really trusting me. Paul said, I have suffered the loss of all things. He was a Hebrew of the Hebrews, a Pharisee, famous man, rich, everybody admired him. And the Apostle Paul lost everything. I have suffered the loss of all things. God might take everything away for you, and you'll begin to wish you hadn't prayed your prayer. And he could do the same with churches. I could tell you the story of D.L. Moody. There was a time in the life of D.L. Moody when he was preaching, and there were two old ladies sitting on the front row, and they were praying for him, and he got a bit upset with these two old ladies praying. You know, preachers don't like people praying. They want to be listened to. And these two ladies were praying, and it was annoying Moody. And he went to them, and he said, no, why are you praying? Don't pray, just listen to me. And they said, we are praying for you that you might receive a baptism of power. And he said, what do you mean a baptism with power? I've got the biggest church in Chicago, and you're telling me I need a baptism of power. They said to him, there's more. And the story is told that D.L. Moody began to hunger for God. But here's the thing I'm leading to. At that particular time, there was a great fire in Chicago, and his church was burned to the ground. And one day he's saying, God, I want your power, I want your presence, I want you more than anything else in the world. Next week his church is burned to the ground. And suddenly he's destitute. He's lost everything. He's lost his money. He's lost his property. He's lost his church building. He's got nothing except he's hungry for God. And he tells us the story. I know it by heart. I can tell it to you. He says, my heart was not in the begging. He goes around begging for funds. He said, my heart was not in the begging. My heart was not in the begging, he said. I just wanted to know the Lord. He said, there was a day. There was a day. Oh, what a day. Oh, what a day. I hardly have told anybody about it. I can only say I was walking along the streets of New York, and I had such an experience of his power. Of his love. I had such an experience of his love. I had to ask him to stay his hand. I say, Lord, don't give me any more. I can't take any more. Lord, please stop. If I had such an experience of his love, I had to ask him to stay his hand. I went back to preaching again. The sermons were not different. He preached the same old sermons he preached before. I went back to preaching again. The sermons were not different, but hundreds were converted. And that's how D.L. Moody became the great evangelist. What made him the great evangelist was that baptism of power that fell upon him as he was walking along the streets of New York. And that can happen to individuals. It can happen to churches. There can be a baptism of power falling upon the church. That's what happened on the day of Pentecost. On the day of Pentecost, they weren't getting saved. What was happening is, you shall receive power when the Spirit is come upon you. It was an outpouring of power. It was a baptism of power. But the point I'm making is, you may go through anything. Zerah the Cushite might rise against you with his thousands upon thousands of enemies. Your church might be burnt to the ground. Anything might happen. God may well purify you. God may well deal with you so that you want God and you want nothing but God and you care about nothing else. And he may deal with you severely until you come to that point where you want God and you want God alone and you don't care about anything else. It happened to D.L. Moody, happened to many churches. Happened in these days to King Asa, this man who'd been so good, so righteous, a great reformer, suddenly a mighty army begins to rise against him. And I want to apply this to India, because you see, I think here in India, we have certain mighty enemies against us. And unless we get a little bit desperate to get rid of these enemies, unless we begin to see how great the opposition is, I don't know that we'll see revival just yet. What are these enemies? Well, you might be surprised at my answer. The great enemy to revival is false teaching. The great enemy to revival is any kind of false doctrine. The great enemy to revival is trusting yourself. You see, the reason why this mighty army comes against Asa is if that army had not come, he would be trusting in himself. We've got a big army, he would say. We've got peace in the land. All the nations around us, we've defeated them. We're doing well. We're prosperous now. We're all right. Now we're going to go forward. You can be trusting in yourself. My friends, revival will not come until you stop trusting in yourself. Revivals will not come, not in any big way. There might be little revivals, but no big revival will come until you've dealt with false teaching. And what is the false teaching of our day? Well, I don't know whether you're going to like my answer. I'm just speaking for myself. I'm just speaking my heart. No one's told me what to say. No one even knows what I'm going to say. I would say the great heresy of today is what I would call